Gareth,
Hello.
you have the tequila there?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a WBC talk. This is round number 7. As you can see, we have great guys with us. This is boxing and journalism, and we have the best of the best right here with us. I would like to introduce first, ladies first, 𝗧𝗔𝗟𝗡𝗗.
Hi
Cynthia
guys. How are
is
you?
from Ring TV and The Real Fight, and also the WBC influencer.
I am. Welcome. Thank you for enjoying or inviting me on to speak with you guys. This is going to be a fun talk.
Thank you for being here.
I'm going to ask you questions.
You know there's going to be some.
Mhm.
Lance 𝗥𝗢𝗨 from The Athletic. Lance, how you doing?
Everyone, great to be with you.
Thank you. Gareth Davis from Daily Telegraph and Talk Sports from all the way from UK.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me on. It's lovely to be here across the pond and at this very, very strange time.
Are you in the UK or Vegas? Because I know that couch that is behind you.
You must have spent some dirty nights in 𝗧𝗔𝗟𝗡𝗗 or the Sahara because it came out of one of those casinos. So that's a very good spot. But it did come out of one of those casinos, actually. Yeah. I'm in London. I'm in London.
Perfect. Dougie Fisher, editor-in-chief from Ring Magazine.
Hey,
Here with
everybody.
us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dougie. And Bill Kaplan, I don't see him anymore. He was already here. He has some,
Can you hear me? Victor, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I know you have some issues with technology.
That's putting it mildly, but as long as I can hear the dulcet tones of all your beautiful voices, you don't have to see my ugly fat face.
I want to see your beautiful face, Uncle Bill. Put the video
Put the
on.
camera on.
I
Yeah.
don't know how, Mauricio.
I don't believe that.
Go in your
I can-
computer.
I can only tell you that I'm fully clothed. I guarantee
Wow.
Thank
Wow.
And of course, you already see him, Mauricio Suleiman, president of the WBC.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I'm so excited. I miss you guys. I like to see your faces and hear your voices. We're going in, as you said, through a nice shot of tequila by Gareth. I'll join you in 1 minute. You can
Me
work.
too.
You can drink at work, right? But you know, this is a time nobody would ever expect. This is like a movie. We're living a movie, but we have to keep positive. We have to keep our mental health as clear as possible. Of course, we have had crisis. I'm sure everyone has been thinking, overthinking matters. Let's not get into that. This space is to clear our heads, to talk boxing, talk friendship, and give thousands the opportunity also to have a nice distraction that gets you through the day. We implemented the WBC talks. We started last week with doctors, with judges, referees, trainers. There's Uncle Bill, you look good. Hand wrap. Yesterday we had a sensational panel with movie stars and boxing movies. That was lots of fun, and today I'm sure it's going to be one of the best panels because we have so much knowledge in this how do you say?
Grupo.
In this group. Absolutely. So I want to thank very especially everyone who is joining in, and let's get ready to have some fun.
Yay.
Well, it's good to have you here.
I
can
see
see
Jake
that-
Donovan. Is Jake? Okay, there he is. Hello, Jake.
Hola, Mauricio.
¿Cómo estás?
Muy bien, muy bien.
Well, I
Mauricio?
would like, yeah. Bill Kaplan.
There are three other guys that need to get in. Can Dan Raphael and Keith Idek
Oh,
and Norm Frondheim, all good guys. And I haven't been able to tell them how to get in. I've just told them zone and shown and phone and balloon.
have
Can
Nancy
you, if you have their
email them the
email,
link.
say it again.
Have Nancy email. I think she was sending it out by phone.
Okay.
And if you ask her to send it, to your email account, she'll do that, and then you just click
I just
on it.
did.
and it
I
takes you
just
right
did,
here.
Doug. I did it. I sent it to Bill, so he should have it, and he can just
Okay.
forward that on to the guys.
Lance
So-
is on top of it,
Bill,
as always.
can you
Tell me
forward
if
that link to them, or you want us to do it, Uncle Bill?
I can try and forward it. I don't know how successful I'll be, but I'll try. I'll is it on email, Lance?
Let me see. I may be able to send this to Dan for sure. I don't know that I have Norm or Keith's email.
I'm contacting Keith right
I
now.
sent it to you, Bill, on email.
Okay.
They have
Go-
to be logged, they have to sign in on Zoom if they don't have an account. So make sure that they create an account in order to do this.
Okay, let's do it if we can the simple way, because
I just sent it to
Everything-
Norm and to Dan.
and to Keith.
I sent it to Keith already.
Okay.
Okay, all right. And then Dan is dannews@aol.com. Lance, can you do that?
Wow. Yes, I already sent that over. Is someone drinking dessert wine? Wait a minute.
Not
Very good
wine,
point.
that's not wine, it's
What's going on there,
ginger ale.
Mauricio?
It's
Good.
ginger ale.
Okay.
Salud.
Thank you.
Salud,
Thank you,
camaradas.
I mean, to be fair, it is lunchtime here in LA, so.
We haven't started asking, but we're already start drinking. What's wrong with you guys?
It's 8 o'clock in the evening here, I'm afraid.
Okay, if you're ready, I would like to start asking.
Mauricio,
Sure,
I'm gonna
Victor.
ask the tough, Mauricio,
Yes.
what about this fighter, this alleged world champion, who's instructing his followers on how to beat up women?
That's a very sensitive topic. Unbelievable. I read his apology. People who know him, they say he's always joking, being like a clown. It's very unfortunate. There is not bad time to do a joke like that. I
That's
mean,
right.
it's not that we're going through this. There's not a bad time. Simply, there's absolute zero tolerance for abuse in any sort of manner to a woman. I believe Saunders is going to have a tough time. I was talking to my wife. We're going to do a video precisely on, it's difficult to be in one room, to be in one house, not with your wife, with anybody, with your friend, with your boss, with your kids, with yourself. And to go out and try to make a joke, he claims it's a joke, but to go out and do it and do a 2-minute video, it's premeditated. So it's not a thing that just came up. I'm sorry for him. I believe he's a good person. He's gonna have a lot of trouble trying to get the sympathy from the world. We all commit mistakes. We all make mistakes. And I hope he has and finds a way to make it up, because it was a horrible thing to do and completely unacceptable.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we
Can I
started.
comment? Can I comment on that as well?
Sure.
As the fact that I know Billy Joe Saunders very well. I've known him for 14 years. It is unacceptable. I completely agree with Mauricio. And like you say, there's never a good time to make a joke like that. The timing is very poor on his part, because he was just about, before this thing set in around the world, he was about to have a fight confirmed with Saul Canelo Alvarez for May the 2nd in Las Vegas. And tragically for him, the day after he made this video, he's taking water in his car to our National Health Service providers. I know that when the boxer Kevin Mitchell, his brother, died, Vinnie Mitchell, a couple of years ago, he donated for the funeral. He's done loads of really good things. Mike Costello, I'm sure, will join me in this in a minute. He's a very decent person, but he just does some outrageously stupid things. And this is one of them, but it's not the first. And I think this is the time he's going to learn that he cannot do things like this, because it may well cost Billy Joe Saunders very dear indeed, from a small act that was a joke, but has not been seen as a joke by the world. I've reported on it extensively with the Telegraph. Mike Costello from the BBC's joined us. The Boxing Board of Control here in the UK have suspended his license pending a hearing. And like you say, Mauricio, I think he's going to find it very hard to make this go away.
It's not okay. Yeah, Gareth, one thing I was going to say is, look, this is a situation that has happened occasionally in boxing where you've got a active criminal case involving the former light heavyweight champion, 𝗧𝗔𝗟𝗡𝗗. You had a prior assault case against Floyd Mayweather Jr. And unfortunately, the woman that was involved in that case, Josie Harris, if anyone here had the opportunity to ever talk to her, she was just a terrific human being. And the toll that took on her life is food for thought. And it's something that we should all keep in front of our minds. This is absolutely not a joking matter. It has a devastating toll on these human beings who are affected by this. And to me, as brave and strong as boxers are and stepping into the ring to do combat against another man, it's the most unbelievable act of cowardice there is to put your hands on a woman. And I think that should forever be noted and reminded against these people who engage in such behavior, because it is completely unacceptable.
Hear, hear.
You know, since I'm the only female on this panel right now, when I saw that, first I couldn't believe what I saw. And I knew it was a jokingly manner, but the timing, there is no right timing for any kind of video like that. And I've spoken to many women and people that are stuck in their home and they're being abused as we speak. So it broke my heart that when I read the comments from people that are like, oh, he's just joking. I go, tell that to the people who are being beaten right now. It's not funny. People are dying right now. And it was just, from what he said, I guess he said he took the video down. It felt like it was on there for a long time. And then everyone started ripping from it to repost it. But it was just, I couldn't believe he did something like that. And it wasn't funny. It wasn't even jokingly. And it's just the worst thing that he could do, because so many people right now are affected. And I know people that are trying to leave their home. And I keep saying, please don't, you're going to get sick. He's like, they say, this person is abusing me so bad that the cops can't even come to my house. I mean, that is how bad it is. And I don't know if he realizes how much of an effect it has on the world, that people are going to see this. I mean, this is viral, completely viral. And I don't think he can come from this, because like you said, the Mayweather, Kovalev, even Gervonta Davis, I mean, things like that, it's just inexcusable, completely inexcusable. That's my thought on that.
Did Mike Costello want to say anything on this matter? I know you may know Billy, right?
Your video is not on.
Hi, Lance. Yeah, and good evening, everybody from the UK. Glad to be joining you tonight. Yeah, this was I was just staggered when I saw this. I just couldn't believe that he'd gone down this road again. And yet, you know, at the same time, there's a video of the man delivering provisions to hospital. And this is the complex character that we're dealing with here, and this is not for 1 second to forgive the man for what he's done. I'm just stating that we're dealing with a really complex character here that is beyond my understanding. I have to say, I think there are times when, you know, we in journalism tend to stray into psychiatry or psychology, or and you know, in no sport is that more evident than in boxing. But I think there is a point at which we can't tread beyond, because we don't have the professional expertise to comment about it. I mean, a man who can do those two things within a couple of seconds is beyond my comprehension.
Danny Boy Raphael has joined us.
Hello, Uncle Bill.
Hello,
Talk to you,
Dan, how are
Danny.
you?
Hey, Mauricio.
Did you all see the whole screen with everybody, or how do you have it in your?
Right now, I see only you, and before you spoke, I saw Uncle Bill, and before that, I saw, I'm not sure who that was, but the British journalist.
You're in the speaking mode.
Yeah.
If you go to the top to the right, you click in the little squares, and then you
Yeah.
can change what you see in the screen.
Oh, participants?
No,
Yeah,
no.
all participants, yes.
That's the-
See everybody.
Hey,
See,
Dougie.
there's a little screen with
Dougie.
everybody across the top.
Yeah,
And
it's
then
like the
whoever's
Brady
talking,
Bunch. I see
they're
everybody.
right there. Yeah.
Okay.
You're
Jen.
helping them now.
That's Cynthia in the middle. I see. She's like, she's Alice.
Yes.
What's going on?
Well, just starting, and Victor has a few nice dynamics that we want to do with you experts. So, Victor, you want to start?
Yes, I would like to start asking you, as this is different. Now we want to ask you, how do you get involved in boxing journalism? I think we would like to start with Cynthia.
Oh, me.
Of course, ladies first.
Well, I mean, this kind of just fell in my lap. I was going through a transition in my life, and my love of boxing, and I own gyms, and I used to work news. So it just kind of fell in my lap. And there was a gentleman that I shadowed for Ring, 𝗧𝗟𝗡𝗗, and I started following him and just kind of thrown in. And then he had to leave because of family issues, and I kind of just took over. I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, this kind of boxing media is very different as opposed to, you know, writing journalism. This one is like the wild, wild west, whenever you can get a phone in there, a camcorder, and you just ask random questions, but also you have to have knowledge of the sport. But I just I've learned from all of you guys. I mean, I've read all of your stuff. I've watched all of your videos, and I learn each and every day from all of you and many more of what to ask them, what not to ask them, things. And you guys learn from our videos of the little quirky things that you would have never got from a sit-down interview with them. But that's my story. I fell in love with it. And that's pretty much it. That's my story on boxing journalism.
Thanks, Cynthia. Lance, how'd you gotten started?
Well, as a boxing reporter, I was working as an investigative takeout reporter for the LA Times, and a colleague of mine who covered boxing for the Times for several years, Steve Springer, decided to basically go into business with Oscar De La Hoya and write his autobiography, spending a lot of time with Oscar. And so the sports editor at the time, as we were going through a lot of buyouts and layoffs back then, everyone was kind of tightening, what they were doing. They were doing more stories on different subjects. And so the sports editor came to me and said, look, we can't have our boxing writer in business with Oscar De La Hoya. So I'd like you to cover both boxing, and we're going to add coverage of the Ultimate Fighting Championship as well at the same time, in addition to what I was doing. So I started doing all that, and I was just reflecting on that the other night, actually, because the first fight that I ever covered was at the what was called the Home Depot Center here in Carson, California, in March of 2007, and that was the start of the Israel Vasquez Rafael Marquez trilogy. So it was an incredible fight to jump in on, and it was it was obviously a tough threshold for any other fights to pass. But from the, I've always been a boxing fan, but for me to be able to learn to, see the personalities and get to know the guys and see how open they were in comparison to doing investigative reporting when you're, scratching and clawing for every detail. These guys are an open book. I loved it. I love the sport. It's been I've been with it ever since.
I'll say, but it sounds like they're going to be questioning us more.
Gareth.
Yeah.
I'll let Jake finish his phone conversation first of all.
I have a recommendation. When we are not speaking,
Yeah, I'll see what I can get out of it.
we can put the audio
Yeah, too many emails.
off in your screen.
Okay.
You can shut your audio like
Yeah, no
Dan
problem.
is right now, so you don't get our home noises into the conversation.
We'll tell Jake when he comes back.
Okay.
He already did. Garrett, you want to go?
Ah, there you go. You got it.
So I was born in 1965. Enjoyed your phone conversation there, Jake. We enjoyed your phone conversation. I was born in 1965, and growing up, Bruce Lee and Muhammad Ali were my heroes. I had their posters on my wall. Then I was always into martial arts. Mike Costello, who's on the call, will also recall that Sports Night used to be on a Wednesday night in the UK, and the last thing that was shown, it was about 11 o'clock at night, was always the boxing, and I used to beg my father, even when I was a little boy, to stay up and watch the boxing. Even when I was 7, 8, 9, it was on at like 10, 11 o'clock at night. I loved the boxing. I loved the thrill of it, but I always loved martial arts. And when I of course, as you know, I wanted to be an action movie hero, but it never happened. But you know, there may be hope yet. But when I got into journalism in 1990, I was covering. There's a very vibrant boxing scene in North London. I wrote for local papers there, and then when I started writing for the Telegraph in the early 90s as well, when Steve Bunce was the boxing correspondent then, and I was like the number 2 on the paper. And I've been doing it since then, really, since the early 90s. I always loved martial arts, all of the martial arts. And, you know, people like Billy Schwer, I don't know if you know Billy Schwer, Colin Dunn, there were the Gallagher brothers who were travelers, rather like Tyson Fury and Billy Joe Saunders, who were boxing at the time. There were a lot of boxers. North London was a vibrant scene, and I remember one of my first events was going to the York Hall, which is like the spiritual home in East London for boxing, and I just fell in love with it the minute I went there. The first fight I covered in America was in 1998, and it was a Mike Tyson fight. I think it was against Alden Norris. I think Norris quit in the second round. He said he had a bad knee, but I think his heart had gone. But as soon as I started covering boxing, I was just in love with it. And I think what I noticed from all my editors, they always said to me, your best writing is boxing. It's brilliant when you write about boxing. I don't think my boxing writing is brilliant, but they told me that. And then in 2006, I started covering mixed martial arts as well. And here I am today, and I feel very lucky and very privileged because it's a lifestyle, not a job. And, you know, I know all of you, of course, and it's just, who'd have thought 5 weeks ago, we were all at one of the most extraordinary events we'll ever cover. And yet here we are now having to talk on screens on our computers and our phones and our iPads because we can't touch or feel each other right now.
Thank you, Gareth. I think I would like to go with Dan.
Here we go. I am 1 minute. I have been doing this now 20 years. Oh, I have a visitor. My little boy.
Yeah, what a beauty. I remember when he was a baby. I remember when he was a baby in Vegas.
This is Jesse, future boxing fan. Right now, more of a Star Wars fan. All right, can you let me do this, Bob? Oh, okay. Special guest star.
Hey, you're stealing your dad's airtime.
So I have, come on, bud. I've been doing this for 20 years this month, but was always a boxing fan growing up, and you know, not my number one sport. I've talked to Mauricio about this before. I would watch the big fights, heavyweight fights, and big HBO fights, and occasionally like the ESPN fight or the Tuesday night fights on USA Network. But anyway, when I was working at the Saratoga newspaper in Saratoga Springs, New York, my first job after college, as a general assignment sports writer, we had a boxing card come to the city down the block from the office, and I volunteered to cover it. It was a Buddy McGirt fight. It was I had covered a couple of amateur fights before that, but it was the first time I ever had gone to a professional fight, and it was the first professional fight I ever covered. Buddy McGirt was in the main event and won. But anyway, and I've told this story before. I got in the last round of that fight, a 10-round fight, which was a pretty bad fight actually. But in the 10th round, Buddy McGirt hit the opponent George Heckley, and the blood went flying at ringside. And I got some on my notebook, and it made me much more obsessed with boxing than I had been before. And I had circled the blood on the notebook. I went back to the office when the show was over. I tacked it up on the bulletin board in my department, and and everybody thought I was nuts. It was late at night. I'm like, you're a lunatic, including my wife, who at the time was I don't even know if we were dating yet.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, the next day when I came in the office, somebody had taken that down and thrown it away. It's kind of ticked me off. But anyway, so I became an obsessive boxing fan at that point, much more than I had been. And when I transferred to another paper in our company in Binghamton, New York, where I had gone to college and where I had done an internship in the sports department, that was in the same company that owned USA Today. And there was a program at the time that does no longer exist, unfortunately, because it was so good for so many aspiring journalists, where they would send some of their most promising people for 4 months to USA Today, which was the flagship of the company. So I applied for that when my newspaper's turn in the rotation came up, and I was selected for that particular role. And while I was at USA Today for those 4 months, although I was covering other things that I was assigned to do, they said, they said you could volunteer. He's loving this. They said, if there's other things you want to do, let us know and we'll try to accommodate you. I wanted to do some boxing, and I made a couple suggestions. They liked it. I got to cover, a fight in Atlantic City with the Prince 𝗧𝗔𝗨𝗡 against Wayne McCullough. This is in like October of '98. Wrote some fight stories for USA Today during that 4 months. Anyway, when that loan program was over, I went back to work at the newspaper in Binghamton, but I was keeping in touch with the folks, at USA Today. And literally like about a year later, almost to the day practically, I had gotten a call and they asked me if I would come back and be their boxing writer. So I was, what do you say? You say yes. I didn't ask them, when do I start? Where do I live? How much money are you going to pay me? I didn't ask any of those questions. I said, yes, I'll take it. And like, probably within a month or so after that, I moved to Virginia, where they were located, and I started at USA Today. First fight for USA Today, Lennox Lewis against Michael Grant, April 29th, 2000 at Madison Square Garden. And then about 5 years later, I'd gotten a call from somebody at ESPN. They liked my work. Where we didn't have a boxing writer at ESPN.com at the time. And at the end of the day, they made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and I've been at ESPN for 15 years. So from USA to ESPN, 20 years doing boxing, know all you guys, seen you at many fights. And that's how that happened.
Oh, it's an amazing story. We have now Norm Frauenheim with us.
Victor, how are you?
Norm.
Oh, that's great.
I want to ask Mike Costello, how did he get involved in boxing?
Well, I'm from a similar environment to Gareth Davis in that in our age group, it was difficult to avoid boxing when we were youngsters. It was on free-to-air television, albeit usually the night after the big events had taken place. And that was what drove me into an amateur boxing club when I was 10 or 11 years of age. I boxed as an amateur for 10 years, from roughly the ages of 11 till I was 21. Then I coached for a similar amount of time. Was lucky enough to have some national amateur champions under my guidance. And then in between those two, got a job as a runner in the BBC sports department, literally running results from the sports room to the studios where the broadcasting was happening, and everything mushroomed from there. Got a job as a reporter, then a commentator. And so it's, each of those different periods have run into the other. And I always say I've been blessed that boxing has given me 3 different lives.
Thank you, Mike.
That's cool.
What about you, Doggy?
Well, my story is kind of like a combination of Gareth's and Dan's. I'm 5 years younger than Gareth. but a child of the 70s, born in 1970. And Muhammad Ali and Bruce Lee were my absolute heroes. And it was through Ali that I was introduced to boxing, but he was larger than the sport. He was like a celebrity. But I was absolutely obsessed with him. I think the first Ali fight I saw live on TV was in '77. So I was 7 years old, and he's fighting Ernie Shavers, who was from Ohio, and my family lived in Ohio at the time. But he became my guy after that fight. And Sugar Ray Leonard emerged about that same time. And to me, Ray Leonard was like a combination of Ali and Bruce Lee. And by following Ray Leonard's career, which really skyrocketed, just following him from like 78 to 1981 or 1982, I learned about the sport. I learned about the different fighters, Duran and Tommy Hearns and the other weight classes in boxing. So I became a fan in the 80s. Ray Leonard went away, and when he came back to fight Marvin Hagler in '87, I'm a junior in high school, and I'd kind of I wasn't following the sport that closely, but that brought me back in a big way. And my guy won, so all is right with the world, right? So, but in trying to follow, to keep up with the build up to that fight, because it was announced in '86 and they fought in '87. There's no internet or anything like that, and I lived in Springfield, Missouri at the time, so I didn't have access to the boxing magazines. So I go to the public library, and I would find a newspaper from a city that had a newspaper with a dedicated boxing writer. So I'm reading, the columns of Michael Katz and Bernard Fernandez and Wally Matthews and folks from Atlantic City and Las Vegas and Reno. The Reno paper had a boxing writer. And I kind of followed the build up to Hagler Leonard via the newspapers. And even at the time, I remember thinking I like to write and stuff. And I thought, what an amazing job that would be. You go to these fights and you write up stories for the newspapers. So anyways, I go to college in '88, and I'm a hardcore boxing fan from '88 to '92 when I graduated. I bought all the boxing magazines, read everything, read every book I can get my hands on, watched it whenever I could on TV. And my major was media communications, with a focus in print journalism and news writing. After my undergrad, I went to Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. But I applied for a number of grad schools, and I couldn't believe it. I got into Columbia University, and I attended their graduate program in journalism. And so when I graduated from there, the first thing I wanted to do was move out to the West Coast, because LA had a kind of mystique to me. I had some family out there, but I used to read about the West Coast boxing scene, and I didn't see as much as that on TV as I did boxing out of the East Coast. And so I couldn't wait to move out to LA and just go to the fights, which is what I did. I went to the fights at the Forum and the Olympic when they reopened during the '90s. And I was working for a newspaper, just doing like Dan Murphy. I was a general assignment reporter. So I'm covering school board meetings and city council meetings and crime and whatever, but no sports. And the sports editor of this paper hated boxing. He would cover everything but boxing. So I said, hey man, if you're not going to send somebody to these fights, and mind you, at the time, Marco Antonio Barrera is fighting at the Forum, and 10 to 12,000 fans are watching him, and the Marquez brothers, Juan Manuel and Rafael, they're coming up, and Top Rank is doing shows out of the Olympic with Floyd Mayweather and Diego Corrales and all these up and comers. So I started covering these fights for the newspaper, and when I left the newspaper, I continued to be a stringer for newspapers, and by the late '90s, this thing called the internet popped up. And I was working at a gym called the LA Boxing Club. And a kid that my trainer was training was one of these webmasters. And so he knew how to put up websites when nobody else knew how to do it. you had to know the code, HTML and all that kind of stuff. It's easy now. But back then, only a few little weirdo cyber wizards were able to do that. And he wanted to do a website, and we got to become friends, sparred with each other and all that good stuff. And we started a website called House of Boxing in '97. And we, timing is everything. So we did it at a right time when venture capitalists were out there looking to buy up internet properties. And we got bought by a company that was run by a dude who was also a boxing manager named Mark Roberts, a crazy cat, but he had other people's money because he had a publicly traded company and he was spending like crazy. And so we bought House of Boxing. And just like that, what was kind of like a little part-time hobby thing became a full-time job. And just like Dan, I've been doing it for 20 years, since the year 2000. And I think the first fight, I was covering boxing for fight programs and for, for newspapers and regional publications here in Southern California. So, I think the first major fight that I covered in Vegas was when Mike Tyson came back to fight Franz Botha. But I think the first fight that I covered as a full-time boxing writer was the first fight between Marco Antonio Barrera, who I adored, and Eric Morales. So that was a hell of a fight to kind of start the run on. And it's been a hell of a ride. And I can't believe 20 years.
The first one, or which Barrera Morales?
The first one.
The first one.
In February of 2000. Yeah, I just had, so that was the first fight that I covered under the House of Boxing banner as a full-time job. Because when Mark Roberts bought House of Boxing, he had a company called Worldwide Entertainment and Sports. We fell under that umbrella, but House of Boxing stayed, and Gary Randall and I, it became our full-time job to operate that website. And soon after that, we hired Steve Kim, who had a radio show locally here in Los Angeles, to come and be a columnist. And Roberts bragged that he could get any newspaper writer to join House of Boxing full time. And I suggested Michael Katz, and he had heard that Michael Katz was unhappy at the New York Daily News, and that was true. And we brought over Michael Katz. And that was a game changer. That was like a paradigm shift, because Katz became exclusive for a .com. And I have to imagine he was the first major sports newspaper writer / columnist who went over to the internet 100%. And that was the only place where you could read his boxing columns. And that really, that moved us up. That moved House of Boxing from auxiliary media to press row. And it wasn't just Michael Katz, it was myself and Steve Kim, who were looked at as kids at the time. And
you still are.
Our growth. What was that?
You still are just a kid.
Yeah, I am.
Just a baby, Dougie.
I'm a kid at heart. Because I'm having a lot of fun. And you know what? Time flies when you're having fun. Seriously, I can't believe it's 2020.
I know. Jake, how'd you got involved in boxing?
I was literally born into the sport. My grandfather was mostly an amateur fighter way back in the 1920s. He was the chief sparring partner for Al Singer. His big claim to fame was he fought Tony Canzoneri 4 times in the amateurs, split those 4 fights. He claimed due to politics, he couldn't really turn pro. He just could only spar with pros, but the claim to him was that there was too many Irish champions at the time. They needed to start bringing up, more Jewish fighters to the championship level. So that was his claim anyway. I don't know how much of it I believe, but it passed along to my father. My dad and I had a good relationship, but we had a very contentious relationship at the same time. So I kind of resented boxing just because he was so into it. So I only followed it casually. Crazy enough, though, the first fight I went to was a Mike Tyson fight. We just happened to be on vacation in Lake George. So he fought in nearby Glen Falls. So that was my first live experience with the sport. I always followed it casually up until I joined the Army. And I went on a leave. My friend was stationed in Birmingham, in England in 1990. So we went to the first fight between Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank. And that environment just completely blew my mind. I actually became a Nigel Benn fan after that, even though we lost the fight. Just something about him always appealed to me. And I vividly followed his career from that point onward, when I got out of the Army in 1993, I made sure to go to every single fight I could. I was at the first fight between Buddy McGirt and Pernell Whitaker. And of course, Madison Square Garden decided that was going to be the last fight they would do for another 2.5 years. They were shutting the doors to boxing due to corruption and all sorts of other reasons. But I just made sure to always follow on with the sport ever since then. I worked at a printing company at the time, actually. So I was just a fan of the sport. In 1997, a magazine called Urban Latino came along. They used to always drop off issues at my brother-in-law's barbershop, and they were looking for sports writers. So I said, hey, I would like to, maybe cover boxing for you guys. So they sent me to a card at Madison Square Garden. Felix Trinidad fought at 154 pounds. He fought Troy Waters. So I got a good story on this. They're like, oh no, we want Oscar De La Hoya. Can you get an exclusive with Oscar De La Hoya? I'm like, I don't think Oscar De La Hoya is going to reach out to Urban Latino magazine. So that ended my very brief relationship with them. I just stayed a fan up until about 2002, as Dougie was talking about. The internet boom came along. All of a sudden, the big appeal was, hey, we could send you to fights. We can't pay you, but you go to fights for free and just, cover them from ringside. So I wrote for a website called realboxing.com. It doesn't exist anymore. But the first fight I got to cover for them was the second fight between Arturo Gatti and Mickey Ward. So I got to sit ringside for that. I got to be ringside for the third fight after going to the first fight as a fan. So I think I'm one of the few that's actually been to all three, but, two of them as a writer. So I just always hustled ever since then. I worked for fightbeat.com and helped build that website up until Rick Reno's crazy ass reached out to me in 2007. They asked if I wanted to come on board. So I had a brief break with them. Otherwise, I've been with boxing scene since 2007. And that really helped build up my profile ever since then. So because of where some of the guys are situated on our sites, I don't get to cover all the big fights, but I never miss a big fight night. And, there's nothing else like it. I've almost lost my marriage over it twice, but the sport just an insane addiction. So it's never going to leave my blood.
Thanks, Jake. Norm, how you got involved in boxing?
Oh, I'm probably older than most of you guys, but I'm an Army brat. So I grew up as a kid on military bases. And way back in the 1960s, we were living in a place called Schofield Barracks, which is on the island of Oahu in Hawaii.
Near Coley Pass.
Yeah, it's famous movie set From Here to Eternity. But a famous base, but we lived right across from the barracks, or what they called the quadrangles. And I used to wander across the street, and they had what they called battalion smokers. And I'd watch these guys fight as a kid. I was in my early teens, and they all knew they were going to Vietnam. So they were pent up, and they were ready to fight each other before they had to go over there and fight. And I'll never forget it. And it was so intense. And then I used to talk to my father about it. Now, I come from that generation. I got hooked on Muhammad Ali, but my father was a big Joe Louis fan. And we would argue, he'd come back from maneuvers and all of the rest. And we would always argue about who was better, Joe Louis or Muhammad Ali. I'll never forget those arguments. It's a generational thing, and I see it today all the time. I find it interesting. It repeats itself with the fighters that I grew up with and the fighters that the younger generation grows up with. Then I kind of drifted away from it somewhat. Went to college, got off a surfboard, did all of those things, and I wandered into the newspaper business as a general sports writer. And I covered the NBA for 10 years and did all of that. But in 1988, I went to Seoul, Korea for the 1988 Olympics. And there was a local kid from where I live in Arizona, Michael Carvajal. And he was a fascinating little story. Intense, came from some of the toughest circumstances of all. And I don't know how many of you have been in the same experience, but there's nothing quite like being the primary writer on a young fighter, and a fighter that nobody else, because at that time Michael was so small, he was 108 pounds, and junior flyweights were largely forgotten. But given my earlier background, I could see things in him, and I just thought he was fascinating. And then suddenly he just evolved and evolved and evolved. And this was during a TV age, and Michael looked bigger in the ring on TV than he did in person. And I also think that people noticed his intensity But at that point, I just got hooked. I just got completely hooked. I was very much in that NBA fraternity, traveling around and stuff. But all I wanted to do was cover boxing. I remember during one of the NBA finals between the Celtics and the Lakers, there was the terrible rematch between Tommy Hearns and Sugar Ray Leonard. But decided I had to jump out that day right after a news conference on an off day. I flew to Vegas to cover the fight. Almost lost my job at the Republic that day.
How many years were you with the Republic, Norm?
Oh, 31 years. And I was one of those layoff, but I got hooked by Carvajal, and I've been doing it ever since. It's I agree with that. You know, I think all of us have had that experience where you just, it becomes the one thing you want to cover, and it's become virtually the only thing. I do some baseball, some of that stuff, but once you get bit by that bug, and sometimes it's not a good thing, but you just can't shake it.
And who are you covering for now? Name them all.
Well, I've been working for the LA Times. I'm working for Boxing Junkie, but I'm on furlough officially. Starting today.
Yeah.
Coronavirus furlough, but 15 rounds, you name it. There's been a whole bunch of people over the years.
That's not in the past. That's current.
Yeah, that's current. So.
Thanks, Norm. There's people watching from Peru, France, United States, Mexico, Brazil, the UK, and Ali Obali says, hi everyone from Paris. Greetings from Steve Morrow, Stefan Pryor, he's the son of Aaron Pryor, Luis Fay, Stephanie Marcos, Xavier Wali, Ali Obali, Nancy and Jill Diamond, Damon Gonzalez, and Joe Serrat say hi to Doggy.
Hey guys.
Stephen Pryor is the one.
Dougie, you're just a baby.
Stephen Pryor is the one who came back with the idea of recognizing the trainers, because the champion, the boxer, is the one that gets all the credit and gets the belt. And when we started communicating with Stefan, he refreshed that idea of recognizing the trainers. So we came up with a trainer belt that is given to that who crowns a WBC champion.
It's a great idea.
Stefan is a very nice person. He's a member of WBC, and I'm happy to see him. But you have not asked Uncle Bill how he started in boxing.
Oh my God. No, my story is too old and too boring. I'll just say that it's about nepotism. Well, going back before that, my father, who immigrated from Lithuania when he was just a little kid, and had a bakery in Des Moines, Iowa. I loved all sports. The only sport he was interested in was boxing. So the big thing of bonding with my father was sitting on the floor by our big radio, listening to Joe Louis fights. And that's how my heart got started in boxing. And then my brother-in-law, who was married to my oldest sister, I come from a big family, was 25 years older than me. He was in the boxing business, and he got me my first paying job. I don't know, about 57 years, I've lost count, ago. He got me my first paying job by lying to the promoter. He was a matchmaker, and he lied to the promoter and said that I took journalism in school, which I did not. And that's where it started. And here we are today. Mauricio, I'm so proud of you, without trying to blow smoke up your tushy. I'm so proud of you because the work that you do and the heart that you have, no other sanctioning organization has anything like it. Your father started the ball rolling many years ago, and you've taken off and you've stood on his shoulders, and you're the best sanctioning or commission person I've ever seen. And I want you to know that I, as an old guy who's been around forever, appreciate how hard you work and all the great work you do. Has anybody said anything about clean boxing and how that stands now? I was off the air for a while. And
No,
if not, can you talk about it, Mauricio?
yes, it's a very good point. I got some heat from a few for being honest, but the WBC, my family, my education, and my principles is to stand by honesty and by transparency. How can we expect to have doping collectors out in the street? How can we expect a fighter to receive a stranger who could be carrying a virus into their home? Or how can we expect the fighter to go to the gym? That's why we announced the suspension of the program until certain areas are ready to go back in normal activity, and we will go then and restart the testing. There were some concerns that this could lead to people start doping and start a process, blah, blah, blah. My response is our top priority is safety for all. Our top priority is understanding that we are undergoing through horrible crisis, and there are so many more other important things other than worrying about a few who could cheat. If they cheat, they eventually dope, they will be found, because our technology is one of the best, if not the best, and goes down to the highest level. And if you dope now, it will be seen years from now. So I don't worry about, I like to be transparent, I like to be open. And if a few take this as an opportunity to start doping when there are no fights scheduled, when there are no activity known, and when we all are worrying so much more about other things, then I choose our way. We are doing a lot of administrative work on the clean boxing program. Now we are updating every single whereabouts. We're in communication with the fighters. We are cleaning up every file, because we have over 1,000 files now. You know, fighters are going in and out of the top 15. Some are enrolled in a voluntary basis, etc., etc. So we're working very hard in the office at home with administrative work. We're gonna be showing the webinar once again to all the fighters who have the email address registered. And we're gonna have one of these WBC talks about doping, so about the clean boxing program. So that's it. We will not lie. It will be unrealistic and unsafe to pretend that we can do right now testing. So that's the question. That's the answer, Uncle Bill.
Thank you, Mauricio.
Bill, can I ask Mauricio to tell us about when he was, because everyone's spoken about when they were growing up. Can we ask Mauricio about what it was like when he was a small boy, being around 𝗧𝗔𝗟𝗡𝗗, his father, and what his first experiences of being around boxing were like?
Sure, thank you. My first experience in boxing, it was going to the Coliseo, Arena Coliseo in Mexico City. I must have been maybe 2 years old, 3 years old. I don't know who fought. All I can remember is going through that arena. I don't know if you've ever been to that arena. It was built only for boxing. It's like a funnel. You have the ring. There's no technical zone. You have just a row of chairs for the commission and the press. And then right immediately are the fans. So it's a very intimate place, very loud. The smell of beer and the smell of and the smoke, and you only see the lights and two people fighting inside that thing. I was just, it was a big impression. I sat down, and then it took me maybe some rounds or a couple of fights, and then I just got into boxing. One time I was at home, and I was 3, 4 years old, a little like your son, Dan. And I was upstairs, and I heard this incredible noise, something I never heard like before. So I run down the stairs, and I find this huge man in the living room with my father. And it was Muhammad Ali and Don King.
Wow.
But at that time, you don't
Amazing.
you don't appreciate that. You don't. So my house, my father, my mother is a unbelievable woman, because we had at least 20 to 30 people visit every day to have breakfast, lunch, or dinner with my father. And either you were an amateur boxer, a trainer, a journeyman, or Mike Tyson, Sugar Ray, Duran, De La Hoya. Everyone visited home at all times. And my father just opened up our family and the house to boxing. So ever since I have a memory, I have been involved in the sport.
That's a great story.
I didn't meet you, Mauricio, until you were 8.5 or 9 years old. And your father asked me to take you to Disneyland and then baseball camp with your brother Ferdy. And that's when I first met you.
Well, that memory sticks to my mind, and I have pictures from that day. Uncle Bill bought for me a snake, plastic snake. I was carrying it on all day in my shoulders. It was Bill Kaplan is one of the dearest persons to everybody. He's a good guy of the sport, and I have had the honor to meet him over 40 years, but to be very close to him. Nice, always humble, always kind, always smiling, and always ready for a good lunch. So I love
And a good dessert.
Dinner.
Or
cream,
wait,
ice
and 3 good desserts. Thank you, Mauricio.
Victor, you have a few questions.
Yes, well, there's some people asking things. Malte Mueller says, don't forget Germany, I'm watching you. Frankie Avalar, former fighter from Las Vegas. Great job, guys. We appreciate hearing how you got started. And I will ask you, which was your most difficult or the weirdest interview you ever had? I want to answer that.
Is that for somebody in particular?
And you got one with Tyson before
Yes.
the McBride
My
fight.
wife heard that. My wife heard that from across the room, and she said Tyson.
Yeah.
So the first time I ever met Mike Tyson, it was the first time I was supposed to interview him. I had just started not that long earlier at USA Today, and Mike did not have a very good relationship with most of the main media guys at that time. And he was about to fight Andrew Galata in Auburn Hills, Michigan. And he wasn't, it was a pay-per-view fight on Showtime, and he wasn't really doing any interviews with the print press. He wasn't really doing any interviews at all. And, but I had become acquainted with Shelly Finkel, who was managing him at the time. And I was working at USA Today, and I asked him about if Mike would talk to me. And he said, you know, that might be a good idea, because again, Mike wasn't talking to the main beat guys at the time, you know, who they had kind of a terrible relationship. I was fresh. I didn't know Mike. I didn't have really any preconceived notions about him as a person, other than having followed him as a kid. And keep in mind, I had grown up in upstate New York, where he fought most of his early career in places like Glens Falls, where I used to work not too far from there, and in Troy, New York, and the Catskills are not that far. So, you know, we were familiar with the same locations. So Shelly said, yeah, we'll do that. He'll do an interview with you. I was going to do a cover story for USA Today, which was kind of a big deal. Particularly, they're promoting a pay-per-view fight. He's not talking to anybody, but he'll talk to the boxing writer from the nation's #1 newspaper in terms of circulation. So, okay, cool. So the fight is a Friday. I flew to Detroit on a Monday, and the whole thought was, because Mike had been in such bad way with some interviews he had done, it's like, we're going to put Mike in a. I mean, I don't know what he's going to say, but we can at least put him in the right kind of atmosphere to like be the kinder, gentler Tyson. So the idea was, we'll go to Detroit, and we'll meet up at the hotel like that night. It'll be me, Mike, Tommy Brooks, who was training Mike at the time, and Shelly, and I'm Mike's publicist, and we'll go to the hotel room. It'll be like no nonsense, no you know, big crowd or anything. We'll do a nice interview, and we'll let Mike talk about what he wants to talk about. I get to Detroit, and Shelly says, no, Mike's not in the mood to talk tonight, but don't worry about it. We'll how about we meet you for breakfast the next morning? We'll do it then. Okay, no problem. That sounds good. We'll do that. Mike doesn't want to do that either. He's not in the mood. Okay, so you know what? I'll tell you what. We'll do it before the press conference. okay, again, this is all cool, no problem. And I have time now. I mean, deadline's still not until, a couple of days. So no, Mike doesn't want to do it before the press conference, but he introduces me to Tyson before the press conference. So we make a little small talk.
15
I explained to Mike, was that? I said to Mike that, he knew that I was from the same area of New York where he was from. So that was sort of like a good thing. Like I was familiar with the same, restaurants that he went to and the same malls that he shopped at and all that kind of stuff. So I thought we're off to a good start. We're going to do the interview after the press conference. It's going to be a one-on-one. Okay, that's also fine. Press conference happens. Shelly says to me, Dan, Mike doesn't want to do the interview here, but I tell you what, come with us. Mike's going to spar. Now, I found it to be unusual that this is like Wednesday of the fight week, and they're going to spar 2 days before the fight, but okay. So I go with them to the gym. We drove out into a really terrible area of Detroit. It was the old Brewster Recreation Center where Joe Louis used to train when he was coming up. I thought we were going to do the interview before the sparring session. No. So it's a closed gym. I mean, this is a mess. Let me tell you. I was the only press person they let in. So it was Tyson, his immediate group of people, security, the sparring partners, and Mike. And I sat with my arms on the ring mat, and I watched Mike Tyson deliver a massive beating for 4 rounds to a sparring partner named 𝗧𝗔𝗟𝗞𝗦. Absolutely beat the crap out of him. I was like in shock how violent this was, mainly because it's 2 days before the fight. So now the sparring ends, and Tyson is in a lather. He's sweating. He's growling. He's not in a good mood. He's just literally beating the crap out of this guy for the last 20 minutes. And Shelly says, okay, Dan, we're going to do the interview now. So not only are we going to do the interview, we're going to do it in the basement of this dilapidated this gym that's like a mess. They bring me down in the basement, and I'm telling you, it's like a Hollywood movie where they have the light bulb hanging over the thing where the police are interrogating somebody, and it's that kind of like it smells and it's not comfortable. We have metal folding chairs instead of a nice couch. And 𝗧𝗔𝗟𝗡𝗗 was there because he was fighting on the undercard. A few of Mike's guys, they're like sitting behind me. I felt like they were trying to intimidate me. And Tyson and I are sitting on these metal folding chairs, knee to knee. And so, okay, I turn on my tape recorder. And again, the whole concept was we're going to do the kinder, gentler Tyson here. But this was not a good atmosphere for that to take place. So I start to ask Mike some questions, broke the ice with some real softball, easy ones about how we had grown up in the same area and, familiar with the same things. And within probably a couple of minutes, it just went downhill to the point where Mike was like pointing his finger in my chest and poking me, and it hurt. Like, he's a strong guy just with his finger. He's poking me in the chest. He's telling me how much he hates the media, how much he hates white people, how he threatened to kill me at least twice. It was really, really bad. And then I don't remember I still have the audio cassette of that interview somewhere in I don't usually save my interviews, but that one I actually saved. And at one point he got very angry and he stood up and he threw the chair against the wall. And after the interview had gone on for about maybe like 10 or 12 minutes, and the interview is now over. And his security guys, like, you ever have the image of, you see like in a movie, like there's some kind of attack on the president or the vice president, they like literally pick him up and carry him up the stairs to get him out of harm's way. Like Mike's security detail grabbed me by the elbows. I swear, and I'm a big dude. They like basically lifted me up the stairwell in this gym, and they put me in the limousine, and they were taking me back to my hotel. And I waited for a couple of minutes, and then Shelly Finkel and Tommy and Jay Bright, who was one of Tyson's co-trainers and longtime friends from the Albany area, who I had known also because we had grown up in the same area. They came out to the limousine. Hello. And came out to the limousine, and we got into the limo. Tyson was elsewhere. And Shelly said to the driver, take us back to our hotel, and then, drop Dan off at his hotel. I was staying at a different place where all the promotion and the press were staying. And we didn't even speak about what had just happened because it was such an absolute disaster. But I was a little nervous because now I have deadline to make on the story. And I don't have anything kinder or gentler. I have Tyson ranting and raving like a lunatic. And they drop Finkel and Brooks and Jay at the hotel. And now I'm in the limousine by myself, riding through like the middle of downtown Detroit. And I call up my best friend, Doug. And I said, "Dog, you're never going to guess where I am." He says, "I thought you were in Detroit covering the Tyson fight." I said, "No." I said, "Exactly where I am." I said, I'm in Mike Tyson's limousine and we're lost in Detroit. And I just had like the worst interview in the history of my career that you could possibly ever imagine. I get back to the hotel finally. I call the office to tell them what's going on. Now I got to do the story. I'm under huge deadline pressure at this point. And I write the story. We go over with the office. Anyway, next day, or I guess on the Friday, the story comes out in the paper. It's on the stretch across the front page of the sports section. And I'll never forget the headline. It's the exact opposite of what the plan was. And it said, "Full force Tyson, I hate everybody." And that was the headline. And that was the one interview that Mike Tyson did before that fight, how he hates everybody. And of course, he went out the next day and he knocked out or made Andrew 𝗥𝗢𝗡 quit after 2 rounds. And it ultimately became a no contest. But that was my first experience with Tyson. But I will tell you the PS to that. So that was in October. That was in October of 2000. Fast forward to March of 2001. And we're in Las Vegas for I believe it was the rematch between Evander Holyfield and John Ruiz that Showtime was doing on pay-per-view. And they were hoping that they could set the winner up of that fight to fight Tyson for another world title fight. It would have meant a third fight with Evander Holyfield, which would have been obviously very big. So Showtime arranged to bring some of the media guys out to Tyson's big giant mansion that was just a few miles from the Las Vegas Strip. Doesn't live there anymore, but that was when he had lived next to Wayne Newton, had the gigantic mural of all the heavyweight champions painted on the wall. So we had gone out to his house that morning before the fight. And so we're all milling around, having some coffee and some breakfast and waiting for Tyson to appear. And I was standing with Michael Katz, who Dougie talked about earlier, and a couple other writers. And Tyson came out of one of the bedrooms and he walked over to myself and to Katz. And I had not seen Mike since that interview ended, or the post-fight news conference. And he definitely remembered because he walked right up to me and he tapped me with the back of his hand on my chest. And he kind of just gave me the nod and smiled, like, "Don't worry, it's cool." And we had the interview with Tyson that day. And I can say that from that day on, and I interviewed Mike and covered the rest of his career, had dozens of interviews with Mike Tyson in person, one-on-one, in groups, at press conferences, you name it. I'd been on the phone. I'd been around Mike a lot for those few years. Never had another bad moment with Mike Tyson ever, except for that first interview. But it was very, very memorable.
Danny boy, I have one question. Danny,
yes,
one question. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
How did you arrange to have Peter Pan in the room with you while you told that story?
My son is very involved in reading Harry Potter right now, so he's dressed up like Harry Potter.
Okay.
There he goes.
As the tie, the costume, the hat, the lantern.
Okay, this is a boxing conversation, not a Harry Potter conversation.
I don't care. What about dog?
Is someone else that have a story about it?
Yeah, I've got a very short one. Mine's a very short one, and it's about interviewing Tyson Fury, and it's a few months before he fought Vladimir Klitschko in Dusseldorf, late in November 2015. And I went up for 2 days, and I spent 2 days with Tyson Fury and his cousin Hughie Fury and his father John Fury and Peter Fury, who was training him at the time. And I had an afternoon in a one-person caravan with Tyson Fury. And he was bent over like this the whole time because he couldn't even stand up in there. It was a brilliant experience, and it was just so bizarre, but it was just, they were living in 4 caravans in a farmer's field in their training camp. And I think I was one of very few people, as you know, I've got a close relationship with Tyson, and it was just a very, very weird experience where he could reach across the caravan and literally touch me. It was so small. It was really weird. And he was living in that caravan ahead of the Klitschko fight. I was doing a cover story for the Telegraph magazine. I always remember it because I was thinking, and I've asked him recently, why were you living in a caravan that big? And he said, because I was going back to the old days of the gypsy living. And I'll just never forget that day.
Is there any other story? Lance?
Yeah,
Norm?
Yeah, actually, Dan made me think of this. I've lived in Phoenix, so I was here when Mike Tyson was at Central. You know that place, Dougie. I know you've been there. You were there with Steve, but this is always the thing with Mike, and Dan explained it pretty well. And I was the only guy. I'd go by that gym, and he was in there because in Phoenix it gets awful hot. And this was a summer day. I stopped by the gym. Some days I stopped by there, and Mike, he didn't want to see anybody, didn't want to talk to anybody. And then there were days that, you were like his best friend ever. And I stopped by there one time, and it was one of those days. It was about 115 degrees in the gym. Mike's walking around. He wants to talk about everything. I'm talking to him for about an hour and a half. And finally, I'm sweating, and I look at Mike, and I say, Mike, I got to go. He says, okay. So he follows me out to my truck. And he's still talking. I open the door to my truck, and I'm trying to get in my truck, and I've got one foot in the cab. And suddenly I feel this hand land right here on my elbow because he wants to keep talking. And I'll never forget this because this tells you how strong he was and how different these guys are. This thing landed on my right here like an anvil. And I thought, oh shit. and I thought, I'm talking to him, I'm listening to him. He was all very friendly, but I realized that if I tried to get in my truck, I could just probably lose my arm because all he would have had to do was yank it, and he would have torn it right out of my shoulder socket. So needless to say, we talked for about another half an hour. I have no idea what he said, but I kept thinking, like, don't make a wrong move.
Hey, Lance. Yeah. That's a good one. Lance,
sorry, guys. No,
Lance,
I think we all get in those. We all get in those situations where we're not sure we're going to get the interview. I mean, I've been, my situation was with Floyd Mayweather Jr. because, I had to drive out to Vegas to get him. And it's kind of the same thing that Dan was talking about. It's like, I have a conversation with my editors. I say, I've been invited by the publicist to go interview Floyd. They cleared a front page of sports for my story. And I get out there, and he's kind of in a foul mood, and he's working, real hard. And it's like the whole 3 hours that he's working out, you're not sure you're going to get the interview or not. And then finally, at the last minute, he kind of gives you that little nod and a wink that you're going to get it. And it's like, but it's like, it's torture, because you're like, is this going to happen? Is this not? Am I going to be in huge trouble? What's going to happen? And then conversely, Dan was with me in London for an Anthony Joshua situation. And to me,
I remember that well, Lance. That was a good one.
It was the best of all time because we go out there as the only two Americans, and instead of lumping us in with all the reporters that were there, they had a special session for whatever it was, 30 British reporters.
Lance, that's how they always did it. The British fighters would take their British writers and do a separate media availability, and then do the Americans separately. We were the only two Americans that were there already. And
for half an hour or 45 minutes or something like that. Remember, Dan? And so we got everything that we needed and more for our stories. And it was just it's incredible. So it just runs the gamut as to what kind of access you're going to get. At the end of the day, it is all about the access that we can get. And like Dan has alluded to with his USA Today story, sometimes it depends on what news agency you're working for as to what kind of access you get. So my whole attitude and policy has been about that. If I get the access, I've got to get the ultimate interview out of that time that I have with the fighter. You've got to maximize what you can get. And so each and every time, I think we all feel that if we can have a great session and build a great rapport with the fighter and get him to open up to the best possible, then we've got a great story.
Joshua was great that day too. He was terrific.
Unbelievable.
Someone else? Mike, Jake, Dougie?
I don't have any Tyson stories. I don't have anything like anything that compares to what Norm and Dan went through. It's kind of fun when you do have a one-on-one interview with a fighter who's known for having a fearsome, a reputation, who was an intimidator or a tough guy or from a rough background. because it's interesting, you know, there's kind of like a battle when you're interviewing a subject who may not want to divulge what's really going on inside, or sometimes they do, or sometimes they don't trust you and they want to test you or whatever. But James Toney comes to mind. But it was always amusing to me interviewing James when he made his comeback. You know, he was kind of in boxing limbo for a number of years after his championship reigns at middleweight and super middleweight. And he kind of languished in obscurity as an overweight cruiserweight. But in the early 2000s, he got it together. And Bill, thanks to your daughter, Debbie, I got, you know, I was able to sit in a lot of his workouts and to be connected with him when James wasn't talking to a lot of the newspaper writers at the time, or a lot of more established media. But James doesn't, you know, he doesn't accept you right away. So when you sit down with him, he just insults you. He'll sit there and insult you for half an hour, dress you down, what you look like, why you got a ponytail. I'd like to see you in Detroit looking like that, or whatever. Why you bringing this Steve Kim around? What do Chinese people know about boxing? Whatever. Very, but he's doing it to test you. He wants to see how you react. The thing about James is I like him and I respected him as a fighter. And definitely after watching him, you know, he didn't like to train, so he was never in top athletic shape. But to watch him spar, you saw that amazing talent that he had, skill set. And some of those sparring sessions were amazing. They were better than the fights. So I had that respect and admiration for him. And as for the surly exterior, it was just amusing or whatever. But, you know, one of the things about being an internet writer, and after the House of Boxing days, we started our Max Boxing, which was our own, you know, LLC, our own small company that was run by myself and Steve Kim, and Thomas 𝗧𝗔𝗟𝗡, who's now with the UFC, and Gary Randall, who was the web guru, the webmaster. So because it was our own company, we covered what we wanted to. So it was a different situation than a newspaper writer, where you have a sports editor, and a sports editor wants to get the most readers as possible and wants to cover the biggest story. So that means you got to go for the biggest stars, which could be, you know, anyone from Mike Tyson to Oscar De La Hoya to Floyd Mayweather to whoever. And sometimes these guys, they become divas. They're the biggest names in boxing. They're the face of boxing. They bring in the most money, so they're gonna get big heads, and the people around them are gonna get big heads. But if you're assigned by your editor to go and get that story, you got to do it. But from our perspective with Max Boxing, is we covered what we wanted to, and we weren't beholden to the general population. We were a subscriber website, and our money came from the diehard crazies. So it was okay for us to kind of cover those guys who were being overlooked. And sometimes those guys were, you know, very humble. You know, they were gracious. They couldn't believe that, you know, we're going to do videos of them and put them up and interview them and treat them like they were stars. Or there were guys who were kind of like mavericks, like Bernard Hopkins, who loved to talk and understood that platform and knew how to use the media. And if you gave them that entree, man, they'd give you the world or whatever. So for the most part, my interview experiences were very positive, because we were covering people who weren't being covered by the mainstream. And for the most part, they appreciated that.
Well,
I had this experience with Mike Tyson. It wasn't quite as scary as yours, Dan, but it was intimidating, and I'll have to say strange all the same. It was at the time of the publication of his book, The Undisputed Truth. It was in 2013. And the original plan was to interview him in a hotel in the centre of London, which had been set up by his publishers. But when he got to Heathrow Airport, he didn't realise it. In fact, we didn't realise that the stipulations around a visa for people who'd been convicted of offences that carried a sentence of more than 3 years had changed. And so he was turned back at Heathrow and ended up flying over to Paris. And so we interviewed him a day later in Paris, in a hotel in the centre of Paris. So all of this had put him in a bad mood anyway. And we were told that BBC Sport were given an hour with him in this suite in this hotel in Paris. So we go in, and there's one guy with him, and a young woman who was the publicist, Lucy, and myself and the cameraman. And I'd agonized over when I would place the discussion around his rape conviction. If you've got an hour with this man to talk about his life, you've got to, at some stage, talk about the rape conviction. And so about 20, 25 minutes into the conversation, I started to talk about the previous time he'd come to the UK, he'd been met with protests by women's rights groups at Heathrow Airport. So I spoke about this, and I said, you know, this was part of the reason that you weren't allowed into the UK this time, and how do you feel about that? And he started to get more and more tetchy and started to explain how he felt that despite the conviction, to this day, he still believes and he's convinced that he didn't do it. And so I just said to him, so you believe that if you did the crime, you've served the time? And he just shuffled forward onto the edge of his chair. Now, he's probably 4 or 5 feet away because it was a television interview, and we'd both been mic'd up with what they call lapel mics. But he shuffled forward onto the edge of his chair and said, "Don't put words in my mouth. Do you hear me? Don't put words in my mouth." And so the whole tone of the interview changed. And you know, going back to what some of you have been saying, it depends on the circumstances of the interview and where you are. And in this case, I was in a huge hotel suite with only him, my cameraman, and the publicist there as well. And you start to feel really vulnerable. And I'm thinking I've also possibly got another half an hour to go here. So where do I steer it from here? And so we continued with a couple of questions about how, you know, he felt the time, where he was in his life at the time. And then I managed to get him talking about Frank Bruno, who he fought for the world title first time when he came out of prison. And that seemed to kind of ease the traffic a bit. And then later in the interview, as we got towards the end of the interview, he offered up this story pretty much unsolicited about the tragic death of his daughter in the treadmill accident when she was only 4 years old. And he described walking into, I think, what you guys call the ER, we call accident and emergency units here in the UK. He described the moment that he walked in there, rampaging through and asking where his daughter was, telling everybody he's Mike Tyson, don't you know who I am? And then how he came to the realization that there were others in there in exactly the same place as he was. And this whole description, having virtually threatened me earlier in the interview, he was now almost poetic, and I say that advisedly, about this scene in the hospital as he waited for news of his young daughter. And he said at one stage, and you know, when you consider this man is completely uneducated in the academic sense, he said to me, I realized as I looked around and saw all of these other parents, I didn't have exclusivity to grief. And I thought that was just the most remarkable line from a man who had been talking about a rape conviction earlier on, had been talking about his life in Brooklyn, where he slept one night and woke up. And I'll just carry on talking here because I've got I've got some camera issues. But he'd gone back over his life, talking about, you know, the night that he'd woken up in bed and his mum was next to him with a policeman who'd come to arrest her for drug offences, and you know, the whole relationship turned into a very different kind of relationship. And it was just the weirdest, strangest interview of so many different components of one single human being. And it was, you know, I walked away from there shaking my head, and 6-7 years on, that remains the most remarkable interview that, you know, I've ever done.
Cynthia, is that Tyson behind you?
It is. It's funny because it's based on, this was taken in New York when he was on Broadway, Undisputed, in August. It was the last day. And I wasn't in the business yet, but I was a big boxing fan and I loved him. And I remember after, I mean, if you guys have not seen Undisputed, like the whole story, you'll laugh, you'll cry, everything. And I remember he was very agitated. And this was the time when he was doing drugs, and it was, no one knew about it, but eventually it came out again. And we were in line for a meet and greet, and I was the last one to do a picture with him. every one of his pictures, he just looked mad. His shirt is soaking wet from sweat, and he was just like yelling at everyone. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, I'm so scared to take a picture. He's gonna scream, but whatever. So I finally get there, and all his pictures, he's like this, like just mad. And I'm standing there, and he's looking at me, and I'm looking at him. I'm just like, okay, let's go. Let's take it. And they go, oh, we have to reload the camera or something because it was a professional photographer. So I'm standing there like, I have a dog named Mike Tyson. Like and he's like, he looks at me, he's like, I go, no, I do. I have a Twitter, Mike Tyson, the dog. And he's like, let me see. So I show him, and I'm showing him the pictures, and he's just like, let me see this. He's looking, and he's like smiling. He's just like looking at it. And I'm like, and he goes, let me see what you tweet about him. And I go, it just, and he goes, oh, you always hashtag me. I said, yeah, I don't want to, I'm scared to put your at because I don't want people to, get confused. And he just looked at it, and then the picture, he's ready. And he's just, this is the only picture he's smiling in, the only picture. And he was just like, thank you. And I go, oh my God, I couldn't believe it. And all his handlers are like, he's in a good mood. I go, okay. And I didn't know, because after that time, then it came out that he was on cocaine, and he was going through a spiral because of the Undisputed and just the death of his daughter. And then he came back again to do Undisputed too, and just started doing all his movies. But that's my famous picture with him all the time. I'm like, I have him smiling after one of, the most devastating time in his life. But that's my story. I didn't interview him, but I did like a quick little show off of my dog.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to close these WBC talks with each of you mentioning your favorite fight. Who wants to go first?
I think you should do 2 fights.
Yeah, you can choose 2 fights.
Okay, Lance.
Well, I mean, like I said, the first fight that I ever covered is just so memorable, and that whole trilogy between Vasquez and Marquez was incredible, because both of these guys, like even after watching this on Showtime this past weekend, it's like, let both of these guys in the Hall of Fame walk arm in arm together, because they were just so heroic. And what Israel Vasquez did to finish that trilogy was incredible in the final seconds of the final round. And then the other fight that I always think too was so epic was Manny Pacquiao against Juan Manuel Marquez 4. When Marquez came back a little bit changed. I think this was before the clean boxing program had really been fully implemented, because I tell you what, I would have had some testers down there on Marquez. But Marquez comes out, and after not knocking down Manny Pacquiao in the first 3 fights, cleanly just knocks him out. And that fight and that result after the few rounds before that fight was just so gripping and incredible. For Juan Manuel Marquez to have had a rough decision go against him in the fight previously, to ultimately get justice as he sees it, was an incredible outcome. And to see Manny Pacquiao looking like his life was in peril when he went down was also an incredible event.
Gareth?
Well, I'm going to pick two British fighters involved in the 2 fights, and I've got to say, one of the reasons, and it's brilliant to listen to everyone tonight, and it's taking me back 30 years, some of you 20, 30, 40, Bill, 50 years. I've got to say, I've been entranced tonight sitting here listening to everyone. I mean, we're in an amazing industry, and I think we're all incredibly privileged, for the simple reason that perhaps all of us here tonight, like, we fell in love with it, and maybe we understand the nuance of the sport, and we appreciate the privilege of the access that we get to people. You all talked about access tonight, and I was very close to 𝗥𝗢𝗨𝗡𝗗, who was a brilliant, almost reluctant boxer at times, reluctant to do things. And I'm a Welsh Italian, he's a Welsh Italian. Apart from the Bernard Hopkins and the Roy Jones Jr. fights that kind of capped what was a brilliant, legendary career for 𝗥𝗢𝗨𝗡𝗗, his fight with Jeff Lacey in Manchester 14 years ago was an extraordinary performance by a guy who went into the fight with a broken hand, reluctant to do so. And I just remember I didn't sleep for 3 days after that fight because the adrenaline I received myself just enabled me to write one of the best post-fight pieces I've ever written. And I just enjoyed it so much. I couldn't believe I couldn't sleep for 3 days. It was in Manchester, and he put on a performance that it was almost like watching Nureyev doing ballet. You know, it was a masterclass. Gary Shaw had come here and trumpeted that Jeff Lacey was the Mike Tyson of the super middleweight division. And 𝗥𝗢𝗨𝗡𝗗 just danced and moved and threw combinations and was brilliant that night. And the other fight is just 5 weeks ago, because here we are. Who would have thought 5 weeks ago we'd have been doing this? I think most of us were in Las Vegas for the Gypsy King, talking the talk and then walking the walk against Deontay Wilder. An amazing redemption story on a night that I will never forget. And again, I have extraordinary access to Tyson Fury, the Gypsy King. So I'm just picking those two fights because they're two Brits and 2 nights I'll never forget.
Thank you. Cynthia.
The fight that got me in, I mean, just completely in love with boxing was Tyson versus Razor Ruddock 2. That's my all-time favorite fight. And the other one, it now has become one of my favorites because it's always a Hagler Hearn, but the other one that Kevin Aioli got me on was the Caveman Lee versus 𝗧𝗔𝗟𝗏. Is it 𝗧𝗔𝗟𝗏? Is that his name? Am I saying that right?
𝗧𝗧𝗏.
𝗧𝗧𝗏, there you go. I remember he told me to watch it on my live stream, and I watched it twice on my live stream with my YouTube live stream, people around the world watching it. Then I watched it again the next morning, and then I watched it again later on. I mean, there was something about that fight that was so captivating that I couldn't believe the other one would not go down. As bad, as much as they were beating the shit out of each other, it just gave me the chills. I'm like, this is why I love boxing. This is why, because of these two gentlemen. Those were my fights, and I never even covered them. I just watched it, and those were the reasons why I love what I do and why I continue to do it.
Thank you. Dougie.
Well, before I mention the 2 fights, let me mention, when we talk about the fight of the year, it's usually an action fight. It's 2 guys giving it their all, and there's blood and guts. I'm an unapologetic, bloodthirsty ghoul.
Here.
The side of that, where it's the art of boxing, the craft, what the British call the master class, what we here in the U.S. will occasionally call a boxing clinic, a virtuoso performance, if you will. And in 2001, when Marco Antonio Barrera undressed the Prince, Naseem Hamed, that was amazing. That was a night where driving home from that fight, because there were no rooms available at the MGM Grand on Saturday night, Steve Kim and I just drove back to Los Angeles. We were just buzzing. I don't think I slept that night because of the adrenaline from that event. And it was an amazing event, an amazing atmosphere with the 2 best fans in all of boxing, the British fans and the Mexican fans, coming together to witness that event. It had like a World Cup international feel to it, just the audience. And the fact that I felt that Barrera had been kind of written off by the boxing world at first, after the back-to-back losses to Junior Jones, and then the loss to Eric Morales, which I thought he should have won. And then Hopkins over Trinidad, just a couple of weeks after 9/11 in New York City. That was an unforgettable atmosphere. Obviously, ultimately a one-sided fight in a boxing clinic put on by Bernard Hopkins. But we have to remember, just like Barrera, he was an underdog going into that fight. Guy who was undefeated, and fans were used to seeing this guy not take people's heads off. Felix Trinidad had that kind of power, just like Naseem Hamed had. So it's always exciting when you see somebody actually go through 12 rounds and contain a great puncher like that. But the best fight, and I think maybe the best fight that I ever saw, that I ever witnessed, and I don't think can ever be topped, was in 2005, and that was 𝗥𝗢𝗨𝗡𝗗's first fight against Jose Luis Castillo. And that was just, it wasn't a huge event, believe it or not. It was like a hardcore fight fans fight. And it felt like half the people inside the arena, and it was the Mandalay Bay event center, were all boxing people, because the night before was the Boxing Writers Association of America's awards dinner. So the boxing industry was there, but I would say the event center was less than half full. It seemed like there was about 5,000 fans inside an arena that could hold like 12,000 fans. But the fight that they put on and what they gave of themselves that night was unbelievable. And I think Dan and I were both the press room scorers for that.
It was you, me, and Tim Smith.
And Tim Smith, right?
Yeah.
And I think I had it even all the way. One guy would win a round, and another guy would win a round, or it looked like Castillo was on his way to winning a round, and Corrales would buzz him, rock him right before the bell, and I would give that round to Corrales. And so, you know, I thought after 8 rounds, that was already it wasn't just the fight of the year. It was like fight of the decade after 8 rounds. And I'm thinking, how can they give us more? And they continued. The 9th round was crazy, and the 10th round unforgettable. And it was so amazing that, you know, there's no cheering on press row. But by the time that fight was stopped, I think everybody on press row, we all stood up, and I think everybody yelled in unison, "Unbelievable!" And we're jumping up and down, and it's like you forgot about being a member of the media. It was just that kind of effort from both fighters, and you knew both guys were never going to be the same after that, especially Corrales, who just it was superhuman what he did. It was kind of reminiscent of what Israel Vasquez did in the 3rd fight against Rafael Marquez. It's like he was on his way to losing that fight on the cards, but what he did in the 12th round was superhuman. And after he gave that, so when you witness that, it's amazing. After Corrales Castillo won, and also after Vasquez Marquez 3, I'm sitting there staring at my laptop, and I'm saying, how can I do this justice? What can I write that can really convey what we all just experienced, what they gave in that ring, and what we're all feeling right now? It's like, it's an impossible task, but you just feel privileged to be there to witness it live.
Well said.
Yeah. Thank you. Jake.
I'm gonna tell on that Corrales Castillo. The first fight is, you know, I'm sure all of us, it's probably, you know, among our favorite fights of all times. That was one of the rare big fights where I had a chance to cover, and I couldn't because it was my daughter's communion that day. So I had to stay home. By that night, you know, we're having a party for or whatever, and I told my wife, I said, look, I'm gonna sneak some of the fellows into, you know, TV in our room. I'm gonna watch this. I'm not gonna miss this fight. I love you, I love Nina, but I'm not missing this fight. By about the 5th round, my daughter was actually among the people who joined us watching this fight. By the 10th round, she's in my arms, just like she couldn't. She was old, 8 years old at the time, and couldn't believe, you know, just what she was witnessing. And among all these people who, you know, in Tennessee, nobody here watches boxing, so it's a far cry from New York. So I mean, to turn, you know, people who just came over for a communion into, you know, fight fans, it's a night I will never ever forget. And for similar reasons, December 18th, 1997, when Naseem Hamed invaded New York City, he fought Kevin Kelly, one of my all-time favorite fighters. Just before that, I watched Junior Jones get knocked out on his birthday by Kennedy McKinney, so my heart was already broken. And then I watched, you know, Kevin Kelly go through hell and, you know, get stopped. But just, it was an unbelievable feeling in that arena, and more so when we walked out and like everyone in the streets was celebrating. It was just like such a massive night for boxing. Like, it was like the one time everyone was talking about, you know, just what, you know, what took place in the ring. It's just, you know, stuff like that. It's like, 'cause in my circles, and I'm sure most of us can relate, we're the boxing guy, or, you know, Cynthia State's boxing girl. So, you know, like, we're the ones everyone comes to for, you know, their boxing source. And that was like a night where everyone just wanted to talk about boxing. Even I had to work the next day at my printing job, and that's all anyone wanted to talk about, with the fights this Friday nights on HBO. So, you know, when I see stuff like that, you know, just really resonate to the public. It just forever stays with me. And to, you know, have the privilege of, you know, witnessing it live, it makes it that much more special.
Thank you, Jake. Norm.
For me, I'd
Who's
have to
your
say,
favorite fight?
yeah, the first one I'd have to say was the first Sugar Ray Leonard Thomas Hearns fight. That for me has always been a standard of what a great fight is. I always measure it against all of the others that I've seen. They both, you know, and we've read this before, but it was so true to watch. They changed up styles. The boxer became the puncher. The puncher became the boxer. Showed a lot of guts in the end. It was just an incredible fight. It's one that I still watch. And my second one, although I change up on this all the time, and I completely agree with Corral and Castillo, but I love to watch. So I'll make it number 2 here. I love to watch the first Roberto Duran Sugar Ray Leonard fight, only because for me, Duran is my favorite fighter. And in that fight, to me, he exemplifies how great he was, how dominant he was when he was in shape and he was ready to go. He was just the most complete fighter. So those would be my 2. I
thought you were gonna say Carvajal Chiquita Gonzalez.
Number 3. No, I was there. That was 2 little guys, you know, and that fight was amazing because it was at the old Las Vegas. I'm still wearing this T-shirt, and the place was jammed with these 2 little 108-pound guys, and Carvajal was done. He was done, but he got up. Somehow he got up, and that was the first time I realized he was one of these guys who was never at his best until he was in deep trouble. And to Nacho Beristain's credit, because they brought him on into the corner for the next 2 fights, which Chiquita won. But he read Michael like a book on that one, and he told Chiquita at that time, just don't engage him, which was hard to do, especially in that ring, in that bull ring in Mexico City. But he had the discipline to do it, and he won 2 narrow decisions. But he knew, don't get him in trouble, because if you get him in trouble, you're in trouble. And I'll just refer to the fact that Carvajal knocked out Jorge Arce, and that was very hard to do in Tijuana.
Thank you, Norm. Mike.
Yeah, I agree with the first Leonard Hearns fight for sure in 81. I don't think as long as I'm around this game, I'll ever see that level of quality in the same ring. But we've been talking here about how privileged we've been to cover the events that we have. If I had one wish, it would be to go back in time and cover just one of Muhammad Ali's fights, and that's all I ask for. And as an event, it would be the Rumble in the Jungle, but as a fight, it would be the one a year later, the last of the fights between Ali and Frazier, and what they put in to their desire to win that night. You know, we've all covered other sports as well along the way to where we are now. I'm not sure that there's ever been an example of 2 characters in the same sporting arena giving that much in their pursuit of winning. As Jerry Eisenberg said, the heavyweight championship of each other, and that just about summed it up. And you know, we talk about fights that we rewatch time and time again, and that for me is the greatest heavyweight fight of all time, bar none.
Thank you, Mike. Dan, I want to ask your kid.
I'm sorry, I was not clear.
Harry Potter's movie.
He's only seen the first one, so we can't answer that quite yet. As far as fights,
sorry, Mike, it was Ali, Frazier 3, and which other one? I didn't get it.
And the first Leonard Hearns in 1981.
Mike, can I ask you which ones you've actually covered as a commentator that you've loved, though? Which 2?
Number 1 would be, for the sheer shock value, Andy Ruiz beating Anthony Joshua in New York last year. As a Brit who grew up, the first fight I think I can remember was the fight of the century, Ali against Frazier 1 at Madison Square Garden. My dad was on his way to work. Those fights back in the UK were shown in cinemas at 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning. And my dad came back from the cinema, was on his way to work, and told me the result of the fight. that's one of my earliest memories of boxing. So for that young kid turning over in bed that morning to be one day commentating in the same Madison Square Garden was really quite special. So that would be up there. And one of the first really big events that I did as a commentator in Las Vegas was the fight between Oscar De La Hoya and Floyd Mayweather in 2007.
Yeah.
Even as a visitor, I realized that there are many fights that happen in Las Vegas that resonate in that tiny area of the strip and don't have any resonance anywhere else across the strip. But that was one where it just seemed to captivate everybody. And I was commentating alongside the former world super middleweight champion, Richie Woodall. And we were down at breakfast one morning, and Richie had come up to me and said, "I don't believe it, Mike. I've just been asked by the chambermaid who's going to win the fight." And I said, "You're not going to believe this. I've just been asked as well." And so we described it as the chambermaid test. If you're never asked by a chambermaid who's going to win the fight, that's how you judge the scale of a big fight these days.
Victor, hello, Victor.
Yes, Bill.
Yes, I'd like to be as brief as I possibly can because it's past my lunchtime and I'm hungry as hell. So I will be very brief. I will be very brief. My two all-time favorite fighters are George Foreman and Oscar De La Hoya, and I haven't kept that a secret. And why? Not only because of their tremendous skills and the great, entertainment that they've given us, but because they've given more, these two guys have given more millions to worthy charities and worthy causes than any fighter that I'm aware of, maybe any athlete that I'm aware of. So I love those two guys. The Foreman fight was against, oh God, what was the guy's name from Denver? Big punching guy from Denver.
Ron Lyle.
Ron Lyle, that's it. Thank you. Foreman and Lyle fought a knockdown, drag-out fight at Caesar's Palace on Wide World of Sports with, Howard Cosell and the gang. And they had each other up and down like Otis elevators. And George finally remained, he was the last one to score a knockdown, and he remained, as they would say, victorious. It was a fantastic fight, maybe the best heavyweight fight I've ever seen. And the other one, Oscar De La Hoya, who had many great victories and also a bunch of losses. But one of his victories was I need another name. The guy from Nicaragua.
Mayorga.
Ricardo Mayorga.
Oh, what a fight.
Mayorga, that's it. Thank you, Dougie. He was fighting, Oscar was fighting Mayorga. And in the run-up to the fight, Mayorga was going above and beyond when it came to trash talk. I mean, it was unbelievable. The nastiest stuff. He even said to Oscar, I'm going to make your wife my bitch. I'll take her back to Nicaragua with me. She'll be my prostitute. I mean, it was unbelievable. And the guy had some good wins on his record. And Oscar really remained a gentleman during that whole, that whole circus. But when he got in the ring with the guy, he clocked him. And so I've seen so many great fights as we all have. But those are the two that might have been the greatest and the most satisfying with my two favorite fighters. There, I'm finished.
Thank you, Bill. Now you can go and have lunch.
my last up, Victor?
Yes, please.
Well, a lot of the fights everybody has mentioned, we're talking about fights I have covered, not so much fights that I have watched besides that not being there. But, it's been mentioned here, Trinidad Hopkins. I covered all four of the Vasquez. I didn't cover the Vasquez-Marquez fights in person, but the Pacquiao-Marquez, I covered all four fights. With Joshua and Ruiz, one was mentioned. I have great memories of intense fight between Lennox Lewis and Vitaly Klitschko. Plenty of the De La Hoya fights and Floyd and other Pacquiao fights. But one of the great ones, and Uncle Bill, you'll remember this, if you haven't already left for your lunch, Vasily Jirov against James Toney, where we had gone to
great fight.
We had gone to the boxing writers dinner in New York City at the Marriott Marquis, and the fight was taking place the next night out at the Foxwoods Resort in Connecticut. So, but Bill and I attended the dinner, and then Uncle Bill and I drove in the middle of the night from New York City to Connecticut for the fight, and the next day was the fight, and they turned in a spectacular, epic fight. That's definitely high on my list. I have so many. I mean, I've covered so many fights.
Dan, which fight was that? I didn't.
𝗧𝗔𝗟𝗡𝗚 against James Toney.
Okay, yeah.
For one of the cruiserweight world titles. That was obviously James's big win where he was up.
2003. And James Toney was Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year that year because his other fight was
Holyfield.
over Evander Holyfield.
Yeah, he was the Boxing Writers Association Fighter of the Year. Matter of fact,
deservingly.
James does not really love me too much these days, but at that Boxing Writers dinner, when he got that award after that 𝗧𝗟𝗡 fight and the Holyfield fight, they would take the Boxing Writers and we would usually be seated at tables with some of the award winners. I actually, for that particular fight, happened to be sitting next to James Toney at that dinner, as well as the late great Dan Goosen, his promoter, when he received that award. But so there's fights like that. So many I could name. You mentioned Mayorga de la Hoya was fantastic. I remember, as Bill pointed out, the massive trash talk that they did for that fight, and where there was a period right before the fight where Mayorga had gone to say he wanted more money from his promoter Don King for the fight. And at one point, after all that trash talk, Mayorga had gone to Oscar and asked for more money. And Oscar came back to the press and told us about it. He says, I just told him that Millie, who was his wife at the time, had the checkbook and that he had no more money for him. So we all got a good laugh out of that. But my two fights, the first, I'd covered some fights before this, but it was the first big fight in my mind that I covered. It was the first fight in Los Angeles between Sugar Shane Mosley and Oscar at the Staples Center. First fight ever at Staples Center. First time I had met Oscar and Shane and all the top-ranked people in person. They put on an absolutely spectacular fight. I still watch it on a regular basis. It was skill. It was brawling. It was technique. It was a great crowd. It was high stakes. It was a fantastic fight. It was for the WBC's welterweight world title. Just an epic classic, one of my all-time favorites. But number one, it's like Doug mentioned.
Respect between both guys too. They would touch gloves after every round.
Fantastic
level of skill, and they gave their all. And that 12th round was unforgettable.
Much better than the rematch where I always thought Oscar I got robbed in that one. But my favorite one is the one that Dougie mentioned before. I mean, it was May 7th, 2005, Mandalay Bay Event Center. Mandalay Bay Event Center, the first fight between Diego Corrales and Jose Luis Castillo to unify two of the lightweight titles, the WBC, I believe, and the WBO. And it's, to me, it's there's no other fight as good that I've ever seen, whether I covered it or not, because it was the fight of the year, fight of the decade after 8 or 9 rounds. And then with the 10th round, with the knockout round, spectacular round of the year, incredible comeback, not just in boxing, but all of sports. To me, that's one of the great sports events ever. And like Doug, who was also with him, as he said, on the scoring for the Showtime broadcast, I can remember like what I was wearing, where I was sitting, how I was feeling. I've covered, I don't know, maybe 1,000 fights, hundreds and hundreds of fights. Never did this before this, never have done it since. When that fight was over, not only I think we were all at ringside sweating from the intensity of it, but usually you just start automatically writing. You just kicks in your adrenaline of what you have to write for your story. I remember I needed a minute to collect myself. I actually pushed my chair away from the ringside table and took like a good couple of minutes to just sort of take a couple of deep breaths and think to myself and calm down and think, as Doug also mentioned, how am I going to write this? I'm now responsible for writing the first draft of history of the greatest fight maybe in the history of boxing. How can I possibly sum that up in 1,000 words or whatever? And then this is when I was was one of the fights when I was writing still for I had started for ESPN at that point. So we were putting things, obviously it was going on the internet. There was no newspaper to worry about, but you're just thinking like, how am I going to do this? And we did it, and it was an unbelievable fight. But I remember maybe even more than the actual fight was what happened a few days later. Now, remember, that fight was on the Saturday night after the Boxing Writers dinner, but 7 days later, down the street at the MGM Grand, it was another big fight, was Felix Trinidad against Winky Wright. Yep. So a number of the reporters that had come to Vegas and gone to the Boxing Writers dinner and had covered the Corrales-Castillo fight stayed for the week in Vegas to then cover the fight 1 week later. So, I was one of those people. I had checked out of the Mandalay Bay, checked into the MGM a couple of days later. And I don't know, maybe like the Tuesday of that fight week before all the festivities for Winky Wright and Trinidad had started, Gary Shaw, who was the promoter for Winky Wright and was also the promoter for Chico Corrales, invited a handful of the media guys that had stayed the week to his giant suite. You know, one of the Sky Lofts at the MGM. He catered a lunch. They had a big giant TV with a DVD player, and invited 𝗥𝗢𝗨𝗡𝗗 and his wife and some of his team who were still in town. And we all gathered in the suite and we watched the video back of the fight. And while we're watching the fight, 𝗥𝗢𝗨𝗡𝗗 is giving us the commentary of the fight, of the greatest fight of all time. He still had a big spot of blood in his eye. He said he hadn't even really been out of bed much since that fight because he was so messed up from it, was still in pain. And we sat there for the 45 minutes of the fight. And he gave us like the blow by blow, his take on that. And I will never forget that. And then that was the Tuesday. Now, a few days later on Friday, prior to the fight between Winky and Trinidad, on Friday Night Fights, they were going to do, this is still when they had the studio part of the show, and they were going to do a live shot from Diego's house in Vegas to talk about that fight 1 week earlier. While we were in Vegas at the time, James Toney had tested positive for steroids in the John Ruiz fight that had taken place a little while earlier, which had actually been the first fight I covered for ESPN. So in order to make it doable for our production team, the producers of Friday Night Fights asked me if I would go to 𝗥𝗢𝗨𝗡𝗗's house and let Diego do his interview to talk about the Corrales fight against Castillo, and if I would then do the report about what happened with James Toney and the positive steroid test. So, okay, I made arrangements. I, talked to Diego's wife and invited me, no problem, come on over. So I went to his house to get set up for our live shot, which I ended up doing outside of the front door of his house, basically. But while we're waiting and they're setting up and we've got time to kill, Chico took me up to his big TV room with the nice lounge chairs. We watched a little bit more of the fight again on the DVD. He showed me all of the pictures from his career and the amateur trophies and the world title bouts. And I basically spent the day with 𝗥𝗢𝗨𝗡𝗗 and his family in his house in Vegas, getting ready to do this thing for Friday Night Fights, and talked a lot about that fight. And it was just a very memorable time to spend that kind of time with that guy after that incredible fight, almost more memorable than the fight itself. So my number one fight, hands down, 𝗥𝗢𝗨𝗡𝗗, Jose Luis Castillo, number one.
My dear friends, thank you so very much for your time. I miss you. It was great seeing you by video conference, and I'm sure we're going to be seeing each other very soon. Let's stay in touch. Let's stay safe, stay home, and thank you. God bless you all. Stay with your family. Thank you.
Thank you, Mauricio. Stay, everybody
Take
stay.
care, everybody.
Oh, wait, remember my new podcast, it drops Thursday, Bob Arum. I had a two-hour podcast with him.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That girl is going places.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Uncle Bill. Okay.
Guys.
Bye,
Enjoy
everybody.
your lunch.
Bye.
Thank you.
I love you.
Nice
Bye
lunch.
bye.
Love y'all.